Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson. I'm Jennifer and I'm going to be talking about Unit 1, Lesson 4, Qualitative Research today. So let's get started. To begin with, we'll talk about credibility in qualitative research. So the main thing you should keep in mind here is that credibility can be equated to trustworthiness. So credibility in qualitative research is the equivalent of internality in quantitative research. So the main question you should be asking yourself here is, to what extent do the findings reflect the reality? So how much of the research can you attribute to like real world experiences and not just random occurrences? To begin with, we're going to be talking about triangulation. So triangulation refers to a combination of different approaches to collect and interpret data. So here we have 4 different types. So the first triangulation method we have here is method triangulation. This involves the use of different methods in combination so that we can compensate for their individual strengths and weaknesses. So for example, we could use surveys, interviews, and a case study. Each have their own strengths and weaknesses, and using many different types can allow us to gain stronger evidence. These types will be discussed in detail in future lessons. The next one here is data triangulation. This refers to using many different types of data that you can find from registrars, from existing surveys, and such like that. So this is just the same thing as method triangulation, but we're using different sources of data. The third one here is researcher triangulation. This is basically using different researchers to interpret the same data in order to gain a more credible interpretation. Because if we just base our findings off of one person, that can include biases. So if many different researchers come to the same conclusion, then we can trust that finding more. The last type here is theory triangulation. We just use multiple perspectives or theories to interpret our data. So we have many different facets to our findings. And another way to increase credibility in qualitative research is to establish a rapport. So researchers should be sure that their participants trust them and that they are being honest with them. So they basically establish like a good understanding with each other so that the participants won't act differently or awkwardly in the presence of the researcher. The next one here is iterative questioning. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. So here we basically the researcher makes sure that the participant isn't hiding information or straying away from what they really need to say by using questioning that guides them to the right answer, or like not the right answer, but the truthful answer, instead of straying away and introducing their own biases. So for example, if a researcher spotted an ambiguous answer or something too general that could be interpreted wrong, they would use further questioning to get to a place where it's more specific, maybe using rephrasing, different wording, things like that. Next one we have here to increase credibility in qualitative research is reflexivity. So there are 2 types, epistemological and personal. Epistemological reflexivity is when the researchers reflect on the strengths and limitations of their research method. So for example, we would talk about the strengths and limitations of a survey and how they would potentially affect the findings. This is important so that the findings can be interpreted with skepticism and we can take into account the strengths and weaknesses. Next one is personal reflexivity. This is basically how the researcher would acknowledge their personal beliefs and expectations and how that might affect their research, because the interpretations are always subjective. And if we know in what ways are they subjective, we can better understand the interpretations or findings. The next one here are credibility checks. So this is basically going back to your participant and asking them if your interpretation of the qualitative research is right. So if someone's in an interview and you're taking field notes, you would, in order to check for credibility, you'd go back to your participant and say, is this what you actually meant? So that would be a credibility check. The next one here are thick descriptions. This is basically a way to describe your findings in a way that provides context and a richer, deeper meaning rather than just stating it thinly. or without context and just loose information. So let's get started with bias and qualitative research. So we have two types of bias, participant bias and researcher bias. So remember that qualitative research is textual evidence. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at these. So acquiescence bias is a tendency to give positive answers. So it's just basically being agreeable. If the participant keeps saying yes to all questions, like, do you do drugs? Yes. Do you engage in risky teenage behavior? Yes. So you just keep answering yes to everything. You're just being agreeable and not giving the truthful answer. That would be acquiescence bias. So next up is social desirability bias. This is basically what the name says, being desirable socially. So your answers are biased based on what would look good, what would look good to others. How many hours a day do you study? Should I say 30 minutes or should I say 6 hours? 6 hours sounds good. Let me put that. That's basically social desirability bias. That's when you try to look good and lie because of that. Dominant response bias would basically occur usually in interview settings, maybe a focus group where there's a group of participants and one person comes out as assertive and dominant and basically skews the rest of the participants' answers. Next up is sensitivity bias in terms of studying sensitive topics like maybe pregnancy or drug use. Participants may not answer these questions honestly because it's a very sensitive topic and they might feel threatened or might fear getting exposed. So this is sensitivity bias. They might not reveal information that they otherwise would with different topics of study. So on to researcher bias. First one up, confirmation bias. This is when the researcher has a prior belief or hypothesis and uses that in the research to basically only look for information that confirms or supports their pre-existing belief. And this would basically involve them denying or just ignoring information that might disprove or not support their pre-existing claim. So next one is leading question bias. This is basically a result of a wording effect. Like the way a question is phrased is affecting the answer of the participant. So we should basically make sure that the question is understood by the participant in a way that is objective and not because of the specific wording. Next up is question order bias. This occurs when a previous question's response affects their future question's response. So in order to combat this, we have to ask general questions before specific ones so you can jog their memory and get them thinking, positive questions before negative ones, and behavior questions before attitude questions. Moving on, there's sampling bias. So this is basically when initially, before the research even starts, the sample is not adequate for the aims of the research. So this is when the selected people are not the right fit for the experiment. So they're not representative or they're not the proper composition of people for the experiment. So this might occur when you try to use convenience sampling because you're maybe low on time or low on budget, and maybe you're using volunteer participants, so this may introduce sampling bias. Last one is biased reporting. So this occurs when some of your findings are not reported as much as others. So you have to make sure that you report all of your data in equal manner. So this is kind of related to confirmation bias. So you can't just report evidence that's positive and supporting your claim. You have to report everything equally so the readers can decide what they want to take that. So as a researcher, you're responsible for accurate reporting of all information obtained. So here we have a chart of the types of biases in qualitative and quantitative research. So you can just take a look at this, maybe try to find some connections, do some critical thinking here. You can try to pause the video and do some thinking if you would like. So moving on to sampling. So sampling is, in qualitative research, is non-probabilistic, meaning that it's not based on random chance or things like that. For example, in quantitative research, the ideal type of sampling would be random sampling, meaning that everyone in our target population has an equal chance of getting selected. So it's like based on probability, but here it's not. So the first type of sampling is quota sampling. This is basically when you sample people based on a fixed number, like a quota. So I only want 10 people. I only want 20 people, and you stop sampling once you reach your quota. Next up is purposive sampling. This is kind of like quota sampling, but you're sampling based on a characteristic. So once you have this, or the sample size and the characteristics fulfilled, you'd stop sampling. Next is theoretical sampling. This is when you stop sampling when there's no more new data collected. This means that the data is saturated. Like if you get more people, you won't get any more new information. That's basically what it is. So here the generalization is made from a data piece or pieces of data to a broader theory. Next is snowball sampling. This is when you take a small group of people and then you ask them to ask more people to participate in the experiment. So basically think of a snowball rolling down a snowy hill. It's going to gain mass and accelerate faster. So it's like a hierarchy type of exponential growth type, if you really want to think of it like that. It's just when a small group of people ask more people and they ask more people. It's like that. Last is convenience sampling. This is literally what the name says, convenient sampling. You sample the people that are more cost efficient or available or accessible. I'm going to sample Andrea because I know her, things like that. I'm going to sample people in my social media because I can access them easier. But this also comes with drawbacks because people who are related to you might have biases. So on to generalizability in qualitative research. So the study by Firestone in 1993 identified these three types of generalizability. The first one being sample to population generalization. This is where a target population is identified and then a representative sample is obtained from that target population. So this is difficult to produce because qualitative research, as we already said, was non-probabilistic, meaning that it doesn't really involve random sampling. So this can be equated to population validity in quantitative research if you want to make those connections, like the ATL skills. The next one is theoretical generalization. So this is basically where you generalize from data points to theory. And this is done through rigorous analysis of data and interpretation. So here we're going to take some particular observations and then we're going to generalize it to a broader theory. And here we can generalize once our data saturation is achieved, when we don't get any more novel data from any additions of our sample. Last one is case-to-case generalization, also called transferability generalization. This generalization is made from our existing data to a different group of people in a different context. So here, basically, the reader of the study would have to make this. The responsibility of the researcher would be to ensure that we get thick descriptions or descriptions with context. So once the researchers publish a really good description of their findings, the readers can then gauge what to use based on the descriptions and maybe use that finding or the study to generalize to a different group. So a study based on a school in one country A, people could maybe use that data and generalize to country B based on the thick descriptions given. And you can also equate this to ecological validity in quantitative research, meaning how natural the experiment is. How can you apply it to different situations? So that's it for qualitative research, sampling, generalizability, and credibility. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next lesson. Bye.